I'm Shazleen Khan. I'm a full-time illustrator and author, and just for a bit of reference as to like my work before we go into why webcomics are like important to me and something that I've like been pursuing in my career. Yeah, so I have a bachelor's in illustration and also a master's in children's books and graphic novels. So I was just straight up making comics like the whole way through. Um, I this is like my little joke current slide because I turned 30 last year. And to celebrate my 30th birthday, I made a flex post about how I have made over 30 comics before I turned 30. And these are like any comic beyond the like size of like 4 pages or something. And I'm also a serial obtainer of accolades. Last year, not last year, in 2024, I had a generational run of being nominated for a Harvey, an Eisner, and an Ignatz Award, and I won the Ignatz. So honestly, 1 out of 3. I feel like I'm pretty happy with that, you know. Oh, let's go. So I wanted to show, I realized the aspect ratio on this is a little bit cut off on the top, so I'm very sorry if some things don't get shown. But the what I wanted to go through is like some of my projects, and then I'm going to be talking more about webcomics as like a topic, and sort of lead into that. So I'm best known for like my published work. My like going from I guess from you guys, you're also seeing it on my side. So from left to right, we have Saving Sunshine, which was the Eisner and Harvey nominated comic. And then last year, I had the comic Sinister Sisters and what was built to be the Ship of Dreams, the Titanic, which both came out. I think one was in February and then one was in summer of last year. I've been working full time as an illustrator for, I think, since 2020 or 2021. But I've been doing commercial work since I was like even before I graduated university. And I fully support myself doing work in publishing mainly. When I'm not doing sort of comics for like, you know, actual big 5 publishers, I also do like shorter comics sometimes and other kinds of client work, usually for narrative illustration. So I'll do like book covers. But here I've just shown a couple of the different comics I've made for like some clients, including the one on the left is for the restaurant chain Dishoom, if you guys have been. I got a chance to do some artwork for them that decorated one of their like restaurants. I think, yeah, the Battersea location was new. So I did some like advertising and sort of decorative artwork for that location. But the comic that I'm the best known for is my webcomic Booza. It is the one that won me the Ignatz Award, which I'm very proud of because unlike some of my other works, which is in collaboration with writers, Booza is a comic that I've been working on, you know, by myself. It's my self-authored and fully illustrated project. And it was originally being published as a webcomic on Webtoon and Tapas, and then also collected into volumes, which I can actually show because I'm at my desk. So this is one of the volumes, and you can kind of see those. But yeah, I was collecting it and self-publishing it as volumes of comics through Kickstarter. But last year it was announced that I was picked up by Abrams for like professional publication. So now these comics, like the original ones, and there are 5 original editions. Those are now being reformatted and going to be published to all audiences internationally, starting in June of this year, which is very exciting. It's like a lovely, wonderful dream has come true. And you can see the cover of that one. It's again the one on the left on your screens. So I kind of wanted to use Booza as our main kind of like sorry, I have 2 cats also, so they're going to be coming and doing things. One is on my lap, you may have heard her. So I wanted to use Booza as kind of our main case study for like kind of why webcomics are important to me, why I chose to do webcomics for this particular like story, and also how like webcomics can be useful as a medium, accessible as a medium, all this kind of stuff. So generally, what are webcomics? Now I was hoping kind of low key to be able to see you guys, but you guys can kind of like, I guess, oh, the chat is also off, so I'll just keep going. I'm gonna pretend and imagine that you guys are like nodding and being like, yeah, I know what a webcomic is, or some of you are like, no, I don't know what it is. But that's what this is about. So what are webcomics? These are sort of like more contemporary examples of webcomics that I wanted to kind of share. I think a lot of people now are reading webcomics on things like Webtoon and Tapas. I have a big X on Hivework because anyone who is maybe a bit in the know with the comics industry, both in the UK and internationally, particularly in America, may have seen the large document published about Hiveworks recently. But to give context to those who may not know about it, Hiveworks was a platform that kind of, commissioned artists almost, and like more similarly to like a magazine would like hire artists, and they were kind of selected and were supposedly on some kind of like payroll. They'd get like ad revenue and all this kind of stuff. Hivework would control the comics and run Kickstarter campaigns for the physical versions of the books as well. But they recently had a very large scandal to do with like misappropriation of funds and all that shit. There's been a lot of platforms like that. When I started being a little bit more interested in webcomics, there was this platform called Manga Magazine, which I think is now gone. Tapas, I think, might have been it, or like it moved, or I think Tapas also had a different name originally. But there were all these kind of like some of you may know a site called like Smack Jeeves, and also I think there's one, all these kinds of different ones. Like some of these have lasted the test of time, some of them have completely been obliterated. But before we had those platforms as well that we're more familiar with, people were just posting comics, on things like DeviantArt or on their own bespoke website and things like that. So when I was like a young person, particularly like, in my early teens, I would be reading a lot of comics on like DeviantArt. Some other kind of like notable ones that you may know is like the cartoon The Boondocks was originally a comic, like a webcomic online. But also like the ones I kind of grew up with was stuff like Lackadaisy, and a lot of my friends were really into Homestuck. So to kind of go into like more the facts, or like I guess more details, the thing with webcomics is a lot of people consider it a genre, but that's really not true. It's definitely a medium. Webcomics as a whole, they don't, they can be any kind of genre, they can be any kind of story and any style or anything like that. So they themselves are a medium to create narrative work. There's a lot of unique things that webcomics can do by virtue of being like a virtual comic on the internet. And that can be things like, simple stuff like web design, adding sound and all this kind of stuff. But also we do try to distinguish them from digital comics, which are usually considered comics that are like a PDF of a print comic that's just been uploaded digitally. So webcomics, we kind of think of them more as like comics that use the nature of their like digital transmission as part of, the format or like fabric of the comic. Webcomics are also often designed for online serialization first and then print later. I have a whole section about this. I will talk about that a bit more in detail. And like I said, they've been being made for years and decades. Like there's loads of comics even from like the late 90s and early 2000s, some of which have survived. I do not have examples of them, but they have been like a massive part of online spaces for years and years. And in the last 8 or so years, that we've now seen them migrate onto our mobile devices through applications like Webtoon and Tapas's mobile apps. So to kind of then think about like where do webcomics appear? Like I said, they can of course appear on these hosting sites. One of the benefits of using a site like Tapas or Webtoon or any of the others that allow you to self-upload stuff is that they will have a huge pre-existing audience. They'll have a pre-established sort of web design layout, and also often like stipulate what kind of images you can put up to then be easily presented across all their different like platforms, whether it be on a PC or on a mobile device. They usually have like like some kind of resources too. So they'll usually like show those dimensions, or they, like they'll stipulate all those kind of assets that you need to be uploading. And some have some kind of like monetization scheme. A lot of people who are maybe less familiar with webcomics as something that they themselves have been trying to make, is people often think that these platforms will actually be paying you. So a lot of people assume that if you have a comic on Webtoon, you're being paid, you're being like, you know, able to live off that, and that's often not true at all. Tapas and Webtoon both have, I think Webtoon calls it Canvas. I don't remember what Tapas calls it, but they're usually like user uploaded stuff, which will appear in the same format as the licensed comics. And the licensed comics are the ones that will be actually like paid for. And those are usually the ones that you have to pay a little bit to unlock episodes. So they might have like 5 or 6 like free episodes, and then you have to start paying for them. There are usually other kinds of monetizations available. So sometimes there will be like viewership or ad revenue, like what is it, like revenue sharing between yourself and the platform, or there might be other kind of programs that they have involved. But often this isn't like very sustainable unless you were one of those incredibly successful licensed properties. I think Lore Olympus is, in my mind, like one of the best known sort of licensed Western comics, because these are also like platforms that originated, I think, originally in Korea. I think Webtoon is definitely Korean. I think Tapas might also be partially or like owned by a Korean company. I'm not 100% sure. But this format of scrolling comics, they come from like Korean manhwa. And a lot of those licensed comics, which I always think of the ones that like, I'm the villainess and I've been reborn to defeat my uncle, some shit like that. Those kinds of like comics are usually the licensed properties that are coming and being translated from Korean, and they're being taken care of and paid by, I guess, like the Korean branch of the company. And then you have kind of rarer or fewer Western creators who are doing it. Recently, DC has also, I think, partnered with Webtoon, and they have a bunch of like DC and also Archie properties that exist on Webtoon. And it is very fraught, and I have many thoughts about it that I will not discuss here. But aside from our kind of modern landscape of webcomics, which is what most people now would know, associate with them, there is also the world of like bespoke and tailor-made websites. So these, I would say, are usually now much rarer because people don't have the same like time or coding skills, and making a responsive website now is a lot more difficult when we don't have the same relationship with like static computers as we do or as we did in the early 2000s. But I still think that like comics like this can be incredibly beautiful. So the benefits of having your website or like a bespoke website for your webcomic is you have that 100% control in those other platforms. So even if it wasn't like Tapas or Webtoon, if it was another kind of thing like Comics Fury or Smack Jeeves, where you just be uploading pages, you do have to relinquish some kind of control, either it be it just like the UI that you're using, or like not being able to choose like everything about your host, to actually having to meet their exact standards like you would on like Webtoon and Tapas. But on bespoke sites like this, you can tailor the website to your personal vision. You'll be able to add extra features and things like sounds, animations, or other interactive segments, and there may be other things that you can utilize too. And this also has total focus on your comic. So whereas on a more shared or widely known platform, you would be getting the benefit of maybe having your work like recommended, you're also kind of at the like mercy of like an algorithm, much like any other social media or anything like that. Whereas of course with this, you don't really have that competition, or you don't really have to worry about people being distracted from your work, but you're also less discoverable. So that's kind of like the negative and positive of that. And also there's more and more comics that exist on social media. I feel like loads of us have seen these two works, if not like other works like it. So the first one is, it's like Pigeon Comics. I forget it. These are my two friends, so I've like chosen them. They're both British creators. but the first one is by my friend Chuck, who does like these cute pigeon comics, and the second one is by my friend Bex, also known as Schnum on the internet, and their comic is called Lavender Clouds. So these ones are usually very like accessible, like comics that do well on social media are usually very accessible, and they have a huge potential to kind of reach loads of audiences outside of people who read comics as well. I know loads of people who are not massive comic readers and they love those pigeon comics, like they can recognize them so well. And this is the thing with it, because it's an accessible medium, like everyone, or like most people have social media, or most people are familiar with social media. Usually, like, you know, you can get this massive reach, but the stuff that does the best is things that are like a bit more jokey or a bit more casual. Usually like a long form narrative doesn't work as well on social media just because you have the restraint of, you know, your platform's like really stringent like dimensions, or people may not be able to see things in order, or, you know, all that kind of stuff. So again, a positive and negative, but it depends on the kind of story that you want to make. You can kind of make a decision as to what kind of platform you'd want them to be on, depending on your own goals and stuff like that. So then, having talked about platforms, having talked about kind of like what your options are for where you can put your comics, why would you even make a webcomic? Well, something I've already kind of said is like webcomics are incredibly accessible, both for like a reader and also for the creator themselves. One of the things with a webcomic is you can just kind of start and you can stop. No one's making you do anything. You have no like investment unless you are really spending a lot of time making a bespoke website. Other than that, like the only thing you're investing in is actually making the work itself, and then you can just kind of post it wherever you want. You also, like, especially if you're using a platform that already has a pre-generated template or one that has like a very specific layout, you're really not having to do a lot of thinking about how your comic's being presented out into the world. So you can just focus on the artwork and the story and refining your skills, and it is then transmitted so easily by uploading it wherever. Or if you're on socials, again, incredibly easy. You can just be like designing your panels to fit like, you know, your Instagram box, and then just be uploading it whenever you're ready and stuff like that. There's also like a massive audience for comics. I think like it's one of the difficult things with working in like real publishing. One of the difficult things with working in mainstream publishing is you often get to a point as a creator where you're like, how do I get people to notice my work if I don't already have a massive following? Like, you know, I can do so many like book tours, or I can do so many you know, like outreach to potential customers, but you kind of do hit a wall if you don't have like a huge marketing budget, with which like no one does. So the wonder of like a webcomic is that you have that massive global audience immediately. Like you have the potential to be able to reach anyone, anywhere, with no monetary investment. Obviously, algorithms are horrible and not so, you know, kind, but if you do have a comic that, or like some kind of artwork or something that takes off, you are able to actually reach people anywhere. They're also easy to promote and share. You know, you can just put a link, you can just, you know, do anything like that. How you'd share any kind of website or any kind of like account online. That's how like simple it is to share a webcomic. You also don't really have a commitment, like no one is your boss. Like if you're doing a webcomic and you're not really, you know, again, it's very rare or often not equitable to be working with a platform to you know, try any kind of monetization with that. Usually you are your own boss. You can just kind of do it to your own schedule, and if you decide, hey, I don't really like this comic, you can just delete it. It's fine. Like no one's gonna stop you. It's fine. So you do have like a full freedom of work, and again, no starting costs. And this is like the one that I think is the most important because I've been talking a lot about how like, oh, you don't have to sink any money into this, but also you're probably not going to make any money. The real thing about a webcomic is it's an extremely good way to market yourself. A lot of, I think, my career success, and like I said, I have been working full-time as an illustrator for at least 6 years. I have been, you know, working like part-time before that and before I graduated. I definitely think I wouldn't have gotten the success I have if I didn't have a very regular and successful webcomic, because it is a proof of concept and a proof of, ability to make a thing and stick to a thing, and also an ability to kind of garner an audience and sort of build a platform like that. So, speaking of my webcomic, my comic is called Boozer. To give a vague, like a brief summation of it, it is a low fantasy, high drama comic set in a alternate kind of like Central and West Asia. And the characters are all queer people of color. It's very influenced by sort of Islamic like mythology. I am Muslim, by the way. I don't really say this. I'm Muslim. I'm also brown, and I'm also very gay. So this comic was very much kind of me trying to create a fantasy or like some kind of like slice of life easygoing story for myself to reflect like who I am and who the people I love are and shit like that. But there are a lot of different factors that went into why I chose to make this particular comic a webcomic. And I am going to go through all of them like a list because it is useful, I guess. So, this is titled like Boozer, the concept of comics is comfort food. I always think that comics are kind of a low art. Like people don't really, if you know like highbrow or lowbrow art, I always think comics are like lowbrow art. It's very accessible. Most people can get into them. Like pictures, minimal words often. It's like, you're just seeing pretty things. They're also very easy for you to do. You don't really need much else than like a pen and paper or some kind of drawing tablet to do it. Obviously, most people like color, or color does pretty well, but you can definitely make like a comic black and white, and there's like obviously lots of manga and other black and white comics that are so strong and striking. I think comics are incredibly accessible in the way that they are both like fast food and comfort food together. Webcomics are also like I said, like very global and very accessible from people all around the world. For me, one of the things that really was important was because I was representing characters of color and people who are from like Asia, from Africa. I really didn't want to make a comic where people who live in those regions couldn't read the comic. I say this, I've said this like so many times in the past, but I'll say again. A big motivator for me is I have a brother. He lives in Bangladesh, which is my home country. And we like bond over comics, like even though we live long distance from each other, like comics are a big part of our like, friendship and like sibling relationship, and something we like share an interest in. And I found out that he basically had never seen a physical comic book because all of the Marvel DC comics that he loves, they don't export them to my home country. So he would have to like read comic summaries on YouTube and shit like that. And I was like shocked and appalled when he told me this. So when I got to see him again in 2019 or something, or actually it was 2018, when I saw him in person after a really long time, I was like, I'm taking you to my favorite comic shop. I am buying you all your favorite comics. Like, I can't live in this world where my own brother doesn't, he's deprived. And it was kind of very much motivated by that. Like, I really was thinking, like, I want kids who are queer. I want kids who are in these parts of the world where people just don't be exporting everything to be able to read this comic and for it to be something for them. And in that way, also be a comfort food because, we live in a society, we live in a world. And when you are marginalized and intersexually marginalized, like back then and now, I started this comic in the first Trump presidency. Sorry to get political, but like I started this comic in the first Trump presidency, and it is now the second Trump presidency. So we're all hurting right now, and it was very important for me to make something that could be, like have like complex themes and stories, but also be comforting, much like things like serial dramas and stuff like that. If you've ever watched like EastEnders or soap operas, like that was also a really big part of making a comic like this, which then kind of leads into the ideas of stuff like, comics as a serialized medium, and the potential of storytelling in a serialized medium too. When you have something like this that's meant to be comforting, easy, and all that kind of shit, it's nice to be able to use like this sort of drawn out way of telling a story, so you're not receiving it all at once. to both kind of make it easy for someone to pick up and read and feel kind of casual about, but then also reinforce some of the themes in the story. This comic has like a long distance romance. Actually, technically has like two romances that are very full of like pining and slow burn. And so to emphasize that, like it's a serialized medium. These two characters often, like it will be weeks or months before some of them see each other or even speak to each other in real time. And so my readers who are like fans of these characters and want them to interact and want them to meet and all that kind of stuff, they're also having to experience that real life slow burn of like a serialized, narrative taking place. And lastly, the way I wanted this to be comfort food for me was I also wanted it to be really easy for me to do. And I'll talk about that more in terms of like how the comic is actually constructed as we go through this presentation. So I had actually experimented a bit with this format. Like I said earlier, I mainly make print comics, and I actually started printing comics when I was like 16. So I wasn't really coming at webcomics when I started making Booza, with a lot of like experience having thought about like presenting my work online, because my dream was always to make comics in print and make physical books. So a few years before I made Booza, when I was still at university, I actually experimented with scroll style comics with this comic called Ocean King. And it was a singular strip. It was about 20 physical A4 pages. And then I sort of designed it as a big narrative strip. And it was presented like a scroll. At that time, I was still posting a lot on Tumblr, so it was kind of optimized for that. And then I also designed it as a physical scroll as well. And that kind of got me thinking about a different sort of format and devices you can use for that. It was also very much inspired by, if you know the artist E.M. Carroll, a lot of their earlier sort of comics were webcomics. I've shown it a little bit earlier in this presentation too, but this is one of them that's on their website. The one that's on the left, what that story has is a device where as you're scrolling down the web page, you see the character physically move through like space or your web browser, and they obviously like move through space in their own comic. And I thought that was like really interesting, so that really informed like my decisions. At the time where I started actually wanting to make Booza and thinking about things like what kind of format would it be and where would it appear and all this kind of stuff, and actually deciding I really wanted to post it on Webtoon and mainly on Tapas and Webtoon. I started researching other comics that were there. So the examples I have is the very famous Heartstopper by Alice Oseman in the middle, which was kind of like a good example for me to see, like, because Heartstopper is actually not like licensed by Webtoon or Tapas. It's, creator owned and uploaded by Alice like periodically. Obviously, is now published. But originally its Webtoon version was just like they were just putting out there. And also this other comic called Fools I really liked. I'm not really sure if it's very popular, but I really enjoyed the storytelling, and I enjoyed the very like slow kind of like character building, all that kind of stuff. And I kind of looked at these comics to see what sort of stories did well on the platforms, what people were like interested in. So that's why I kind of also wanted to do something that was like more of a slow burn or more of a romance and drama kind of based story. But also, you can't just kind of look at other people's work, you also have to use your brain. The story of Booza was something that I had actually been working on since I was a teenager, but I, grew up, and when you grow up, your ideas about what kind of story you want to write, like, fundamentally changes. One of the things that changed the most for me was I really wanted to, again, represent people like myself, represent my culture and the cultures neighboring me. And so I started doing a lot of research into like Islamic like architecture, clothing. This comic's also set in like the 90s, so I did a lot of like research into fashion design at the time. All of these elements, things like architecture, like clothing design and shit like that, all of them are very intrinsic to portraying the world of the comic and kind of making both the comic stand out from its peers and also have like its own identity and all that kind of stuff, right? So these are the kind of examples I wanted to show is what does like a place tell you about a person? a lot of the environments that I'm showing is just everyday locations, but they're still drawn in a specific way or informed by the kind of world I want to build, even if they are something just like a market or like a nail salon or something like that, right? What sorry. Um, you also have to think about things like wealthy areas and versus like working class areas and what kind of makes them distinctive, what gives those signifiers of class while also keeping it feeling like it's the same world. This comic again is set in like a 90s, it's set in like the Middle East slash West Asia. And so it's really important for me to have that architectural style, but still define these areas that are maybe poorer or more wealthy, or a lot of our characters work in kind of official government buildings or in places of worship. So it's important for me to show that like ornateness in the design and things like that. You know, you can kind of look through these ones and you can see again, the ones on the left are more like run down and the ones on the right are more built up and more luxurious. And this is again also important because class and all these kind of thing and like economic circumstance is a theme of this comic, so it's really important to be able to depict that. Also speaking again about costume design, what do clothes say about like each character? One of the things I try to do is with, again, this is a comic that has like 40, nearly 50 chapters online. Every character wears a different outfit every chapter because they're going through the world. And again, it's a slice of life comic, so it's really important for me to make that world feel really alive and true. So each character has like a very specific style that they wear. They obviously have like you know, like color schemes that they kind of stick to as well. But I try to have like some kind of consistency there to tell you something about them and tell you something about what kind of lifestyle they live through the clothes they're wearing. I'm sure if you can look at these characters, you can immediately see like parts of their personality, hopefully. And this is kind of, because I do this kind of presentation on and off over the last few years. This is a new slide I added because I went to a event a few weeks ago and someone came to my table and they looked at the cover of my book or something and they're like, yeah, that's just like a generic protagonist. And I was like, yeah, yeah, he is. Yeah, yeah, I did make a generic protagonist, but I wanted to kind of highlight how even the most generic light-skinned boy still has a lot of thought into his character design. This is the main character of the comic. His name's Zach. He is a Turkish, he's a biracial Turkish character, but we don't really know much about his parentage. And also, this is a world where people are, you know, there are magical creatures, and he is one of them. His mother is a kind of bird spirit. So a lot of things about his design are meant to reinforce these little thematic elements of his identity. You'll see there's like this traditional Turkish outfit, which very much informed the proportions of his costume design, which was also very influenced by sort of 90s fashion and also contemporary Indian fashion, because South Asia, particularly like the Indian subcontinent of like India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, we've always had a very like strong and ancient like textile culture. So I wanted to, in this world, sort of imagine what that textile culture and export would be like and how that would be probably like a big, you know, like a big part of the fashion design in this kind of fantastical 90s Asia that I'm constructing. So that is all influence on him. But also he is a character who, like I said, his mother is a bird. He's meant to be like a vulture as well. So he has this kind of ruffle or like a little fur trim of you know, like whatever on his jacket to kind of represent like a vulture as well. So all of these things sort of inform that design. And I try and carry that through with all my different characters to sort of say things about them in that way. And again, an audience member or a reader might not really realize that, but then slowly, you know, it might start saying something to them over time. So earlier we were sort of talking about making this comic feel easy for myself. I sort of explained all the research, all of the things that, you know, has gone into making the comic and making the world. Then we actually have to make the pages of the comic, right? So this is a part that I call the clinical truth of just nailing a work cycle. One of the things that many people who do webcomics, I feel like it's a hole they fall down, or like it's kind of like a trap, is that a lot of people make webcomics and they think only about the webcomic version, which is totally fine. But then sometimes they later down the line are like, oh, I really do want it to be a book though. Like I said earlier, my dream was always to work in publishing and to physically work with like real reading books, because I love bookmaking and it's just who I am. So when I started making this comic, I knew from the get-go, even though I wanted it to be online, I also wanted to be able to make it as a physical comic as well. Mostly because I wanted to sell them at events and, like I was planning to do them through Kickstarters and stuff, and not really planning for like traditional publication. But I still wanted to make sure that the online version felt really optimized for online, but the physical version felt very like a real book. Like I didn't want there to be any discrepancy. So for myself, what I did was design a way to draw these comics that made it extremely easy for me to cut them up and then, manipulate the layouts to become like an online scroll format. So the comic is first designed as a physical print comic with the correct dimensions and all that kind of stuff. All the text is laid out, so you can see my step by step. I have my like rough sketch of like what the panel layouts are going to be. I'll sort of write my script either on there directly or on a separate document, and then I'll sort of like, type it in afterwards. I'll arrange all my text and then do a little bit more drafting. And then I'll go straight to inks. And I chose to do a very flat color style for this entire comic. And then the final page you see there is the finalized version where I add like a tint to kind of give it more of a retro feel. I didn't talk about it in this presentation, but another way that I made this really easy for myself is I do literally work on like, there's a line work layer, there's a box layer, there's a text layer, like it's like text, bubble, box, line work, color. That's all we have. There's no other effects. Like very rarely some characters require some kind of like special effects, or there might be a panel that needs like, like sound effects or some kind of like visual extras. But mostly I'm working in a very limited amount of layers. You can see that there's not that many overlaps. I'm gonna like skip right back in this presentation to kind of compare a little too. So these are some of the other pages that I've been making for like other clients, right? If you look at the one very on the right side, that has like a much more free-form design of the sort of imagery. It's not as easy to optimize something like that where you have kind of all your line work is kind of merging into itself. Whereas, and I mean, I can kind of talk about it in this page too, some of these other comics are made to then be manipulated. So both the Dishoom comic and the comic in the center were made, much like Boozer, to be optimized for web or for other formats, so I could easily like clip out the panels and rearrange them. We're gonna skip right through. But that's how like Boozer is designed. So you can kind of very easily see how that would be changed. This is kind of like an example of that. When it is in print, you'll have that whole page, and you'll have like, the 1, 2, 3, like 6, you have like 6 panels for the page. Whereas on the online format, because you're just seeing it on a tiny screen, you might see like only a couple of panels at a time in 1 line or 2 lines of dialogue and stuff. The idea with this as well is I try to optimize it so that wherever you're scrolling on the screen, so if your screen's like this big, you're always seeing a little bit of artwork or a little bit of text that kind of encourages you to keep scrolling through. It's just like a visual like device to keep the narrative flowing and feel very seamless for our readers. This is another example of how so this is trying to like show that, right, or like emulate it without it being live. But you can see how like as you scroll down the page, you'll always have a little artwork, always a little thing. And I tried to pace this out to feel reflective of how a real conversation or how I'd want a person reading it to move through. Areas where I do want there to be a little surprise or a little bit more of a pause, I'll increase this white space between the panels, or I might, like someone might be like, oh, I'm not sure, I'll like drag that text out so then it feels again like more nervous, or to emphasize different emotions in the comic. So also we were talking about comics being serialized, and I was again speaking about how I break these up. with the comic being both something for print and also for online, I do try and organize all my organize the comic as chapters. So I write them as like, there'll be like chapter 1, 2, 3. And there is, of course, like an overarching like narrative that I have planned out, and I sort of pace the chapters within that. And I think about the volumes, or like where I want a volume to end and stuff like that. But for it to be an online comic, there's an increased fragmentation of the storytelling because of like what my upload schedule is. So I'm going to just kind of read from here, and then I'll kind of talk in more detail. So for you guys who are making webcomics or interested in making webcomics, just to clarify, webcomics can be any length. They can be short, long, one-offs, or a series of unconnected pages. Most webcomics are serials though, so usually they are telling one story and presenting like new strips at a time. Boozer itself is heavily designed around its serialized format. It takes inspiration from soap operas and pulp fiction of previous decades, as well as contemporary webcomics. So like that was kind of what I was saying before. But the serialized nature of Boozer was really, really important to me. Like I was saying before, I like to emphasize kind of the yearning of our main couples by increasing the time, the real life time from which they, talk to each other. I also very devastatingly left the comic on hiatus for a long time. It's been on hiatus for nearly over a year, I think now. And the very last update of Boozer at the current time of speaking was called Cliffhangers. And our main characters, spoilers, have a massive falling out, and my readers don't know what's going to happen. And I'm just leaving it there, kind of putting a little salt in the wound. But when I sort of make these chapters, even though I kind of have an idea of how many pages they're going to be, I'll plan out the pages and stuff for like the print version of the comic. I'm also still thinking about how I can stretch that out. And like you can see on the side of the page here, some of these chapters are listed as like Blue Hour 1, 2, 3. I'll sort of explain what that is. Yeah, so it's like chapters, and I kind of said all this stuff already. The last line is the most important. The reason I kind of stretch them out, and it's not just the main chapter, I then make them even smaller. It's so that I can have an increase of buffer, and I'm not kind of overloading the story at once. When I sort of make chapters of Boozer, they will be like not a standard size. So I kind of allow the chapters to be as many pages as I want, kind of depending on what part of the story we're at and things like that. Again, this is kind of something that I have the freedom to do because I don't have like a publisher or an editor telling me what to do, where I didn't until recently. But like for the majority of this comic, I'm my own boss, so I can say whatever. So some of the chapters I kind of use as shorter comics where they're going to be just maybe like 6 pages, 8 pages, 12 pages, and they'll just have like maybe a single scene or a single sequence of events. And I'll usually upload that as one big chapter online. So this chapter called Lazy Saturday, I probably would have just uploaded it in one upload on one of the scheduled times. Other chapters of Boozer, such as this early chapter called Good Morning Dalit Al-Harir, is written to be much longer and encompasses a lot more different scenes and a lot more different beats. Here I like to kind of break up the story into episodes depending on sort of like, again, those scene changes, all those different beats in the narrative. So it kind of creates a satisfying mini like update within the bigger chapter. So I want to make sure that every single update I put up, it's like the readers will be like, oh, at the end, like they'll be like, oh, what's going to happen? Or like, oh, that's a new thing that's been introduced. Like I try to end it on something interesting, and the structure of a longer chapter for me often has those little micro moments of like surprise or conflict or whatever. So for example, this is a segment, oh, it's disappeared on here. Sorry, I can't really show it because it's like disappeared on, yeah. It's disappeared. I had like an annotation, but I can't like point out right now. But yeah, so the main thing is that I do try and end it either on like some kind of dialogue piece or some kind of like reveal that will make audiences kind of have something to talk about at the end. There is like, of course, challenges of long format storytelling. Often audiences, especially if you're doing a comic like mine, which has been running for now like 6 years or something, Audiences often forget what's going on. You have to kind of balance a lot of different, like my comic particularly, there's a lot of characters. There's like, it's about a 6, 7 person ensemble cast. There's a lot of different storylines happening. I would say personally, there's like 4/5 main characters, and having to balance the screen time with all of them and their respective like journeys, it can be quite difficult. And I know my audience forgets all the time. Sometimes this can be used to your advantage. For example, when a character is missing for months in real time, readers are extra happy to see them. That's definitely happened in my comic before. But recently, I've been trying to add things like at the bottom of my update, I'll say, hey, just as a recap, you can go back and read this chapter, this chapter, this chapter to catch you up on this storyline. And I think readers have found that kind of helpful. I actually was inspired because some readers were recommending it to each other in my comments. And I was like, hey, I'll do that actually officially so that you guys can all feel caught up. These are some comics I wanted to sort of show at the end. So I've been talking a lot about my own work, but just to sort of bring it back to other comics as well. These are more of E.M. Carroll, I believe is their name. One of the things that was like interesting about this particular comic, which is I think called When the Darkness Presses, is E.M. Carroll had fake adverts around their comic page. So you'll see that at the start, it starts out kind of like normal and nice, and all the like, fake adverts are very pleasant. But then slowly, as the comic keeps wearing on, these fake adverts sort of change and become more foreboding and scary. And I think that's like an interesting way to use like a web format to kind of emphasize the narrative you're displaying. I also wanted to point out this comic called Superpose. I think it's so interesting and so inspiring. I love the kind of layout of the website. It really emphasizes the setting and sort of world of the comic, even if it doesn't have the same narrative devices as like some other comics might utilize. But I really like recommend you guys look at that comic if you're interested in an amazing sort of bespoke website. That one's really good. And lastly, I wanted to end on tips for making webcomics. This is kind of my little summation after we've done a lot of chatting. So my tips are know how long you want it to be. For myself, I knew I was going to write a really big story. I have exactly the amount of story I want in mind, and I have like a timeline in mind as well. And I'm like, after that, that's it. After I've done, it's done. You should try and keep a consistent upload schedule. For myself, that was about every 2 weeks I'd upload a comic, and then I'd go on long hiatuses. Currently, we're sadly on a hiatus, but I really, recommend everyone sort of, if you're doing an upload schedule, try and stick to something manageable, like once every week, once every month, or once every 2 weeks. Some webtoon artists, they do upload like multiple times a week, and that's quite unfeasible a lot of the time. You can be your own judge as to how many pages you want to upload at once. Loads of people upload like a single A4 page every week, and you can have a successful comic like that too. It just kind of depends on, your own goals for your work. So similar to that, make sure it's manageable to keep working on, especially if you are really invested in your story and you really want to tell a massive narrative. Really try and make it manageable, be serious and, like diligent with your work schedule, but also honest with how much you actually want to invest into making a comic. And also, one of the things with webcomics is, especially if you're on something like Tapas, it's good to kind of speak to and support other creators. So there may be creators that you're really inspired by, or creators who, like are uploading in the same space as you. And it, other than just for research purposes, you should definitely be reading and commenting and looking at their work. You can definitely make friends like that. Like, I feel like community is so important across all of creative like careers and stuff like that. Something that's sweet, or I think is sweet, is myself, my friend Harry, and my friend Mal. We all, and I'm saying this already, spoilers, we're friends. I basically made friends with a lot of people who used to upload their comic on the same day, and we'd sit there and chat together and be like, oh my god, gang, gang, gang. Like, we're all putting our comics up on a Monday. And now we have a group chat, me and my two friends, we're on our little group chat every day chatting about like our work week, and we're all self-employed and work as illustrators full time. So we kind of, boost each other up, tell each other what our goals for the day are, and kind of hold each other accountable to meet our goals, or we'll, be like, it's okay if you didn't get it today. You worked hard anyway. So I think like being able to build those relationships with your peers and community. It can be so helpful if you are looking to do this kind of career full time. So I really recommend make friends. And again, what is this, like, set your own goals and don't worry about comparing yourself to others. It's important to look at other people with, joy and empathy and excitement, and not as like, oh, they're stealing my viewers. Like, it's not the way to go about it. So, like, have your own goals in mind. I think genuinely holding yourself only in competition with your own self and your own goals and what you want to achieve from your work is the best way to not get these kind of feelings of competitiveness or feeling like insecure about your work too. So really focus on what you want to obtain from comics, and then when you are dealing with other creators, like, think of collaboration, think of mutual support and aid and stuff like that. And lastly, don't be scared to quit. Don't be scared to take breaks or to start over. There's really no rules, especially when it comes to webcomics. Like I've been saying, no one was my boss. No one's making you do it. Comics should be fun, and this should be, like, especially webcomics, should be something that's really easy for you to get into, easy for you to stop if you decide, hey, my life is a bit too overwhelming, or I don't like where this comic's going. I want to start over and make something better. Loads of people do get into a cycle sometimes of like starting, restarting, but so long as you're kind of learning something from each project, I think, you'll always get something out of it. So those are my main tips. I think that is basically the end of my presentation. So I'm going to invite Sarah and Sarah to come back. And I think our Comics Youth mentees, peers, students have given us some questions. So if Sarah, you could read out the questions and also answer them, and then we can open it up to the floor for more, if any of our, attendees have any questions I didn't answer in the, in the presentation, or ones I've been sent in advance, you can pike up, put your little hands up. And we'll go through
Cool.
them as
Thank you
well.
so much. That was so like thoughtful and thorough. Thank you so much, Shazleen. I really enjoyed listening to that. And so many gems, so much like wisdom. It's really important to have like community and also to have fun. And like, yeah, I just loved all of the specific examples that you gave as well. It was just really, really cool. Thank you so much.
Thank you so
So
much for
yeah, the chat
having
is
me.
Oh yeah, of course, our pleasure. The chat is open if anybody wants to type their questions into there, or if it's easier to like maybe use the mic, we could maybe do that. But
I'm
I'm gonna
gonna
ask,
stop. Oh, is it okay if
yeah,
I stop sharing as well? Just so then it's
yeah,
easier for me to see the
absolutely.
questions and stuff. Okay.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
Cool. So yeah, I just have like a few questions that our Comics Declassified crew kind of pre-prepared. So what we'll do is we'll go through a few of these and then we'll go to the chat and then we'll come back if that's okay with you.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Yeah, perfect. And like, I'm so sorry if you've already covered some of these points, but maybe it's still good to like, add in some extra ideas if you
Yeah.
have them. And if
Yeah,
not,
no,
like,
absolutely.
we can move on.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, okay. So the first one was asking if you have any like recommended material for studying webcomics to get better at creating webcomics. I know
So
you
I
gave
do.
like some amazing examples, but yeah, like throw
Yeah,
in
so
anything else you got.
yeah, so my first thing, I'm gonna grab some books, but I'm gonna be talking to you. I
Yeah,
feel like the
perfect.
number one thing is you gotta just read some comics. Like you can't learn a thing if you don't know what the thing looks like. So I definitely
Yeah.
recommend just read a bunch of web comics, but also like read uh physical comics too. There may be devices that you learn through physical comics, because these are just kind of modes of transmission. Again, it's not like it's a medium, it's not like a genre or whatever. You should read widely. Any kind of narrative medium will help inform your storytelling and all that kind of stuff. So any sort of like writing advice, filmmaking advice, all that kind of stuff, that it will all influence the way that you are a visual storyteller, and any sort of resource like that will be really helpful. But I will highlight some books that are my favorites to recommend, and everyone's definitely been recommending these already. And it's the Scott McClouds, it's the like
Oh,
making
nice.
comics, yeah. uh Understanding comics. These are like great,
Perfect.
yeah, great comics about making comics. I also wanted to show one series which is called um Framed Ink. These are more just general like comic making advice and sort of guidance books in the form, like this one is in the form of a comic. I really do love and understanding comics. Like myself and my girlfriend were genuinely like looking and reading it for fun the other day because it's such a it's a
It's
lovely
impressive.
introspective. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
so introspective and so good. But I really recommend this book series as well called Framed Ink. It talks a lot. If you notice during my presentation, I really lean a lot on heavy blacks and line work to carry my art. So looking at books like this that talk about how like composition can kind of be like a narrative device too, you can kind of see it's all about using like heavy inks and that kind of art style and how you can utilize it to set scenes and moods and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. Cool. So
Nice.
yeah. So the
Cool.
next
Thank you.
question.
Those are some good examples. Maybe we can jump to the chat and then come back again. What do you
Um,
think?
I would prefer we go through these real fast and then we can
Okay,
do the
let's
chat.
do it.
Yeah. Yeah. I'd
Let's do
like to
it.
just go through all of these real quick, just so that
There's
we
about
do.
12 questions just to give you a heads
Yeah,
up.
I know. I've got them on my
But
screen too.
yeah,
I got them on my
cool.
screen too. It's okay. But
Okay,
yeah.
amazing. So in that case, I guess yeah, you did already talk about this one as well, but like in your opinion, what are the advantages of webcomics as a medium for storytelling as opposed to print?
As
I know
opposed to
you've like
print.
brought
Yeah.
up some of that already.
No worries. I think like definitely it's the accessibility. That's like the main thing. It's
Yeah.
literally you have zero upfront cost. If you have something to draw on and you have a computer or like some kind of tablet, usually most kids now have like iPads. You got an iPad, you got Procreate, you can make a comic. Like that's all you need. I like a Procreate is like £10, £12 on like the App Store and you get like you already have a device to draw it. So it's accessibility. It's like once you have the means of making art, you can just put it on the internet. It's not hard now. Genuinely, you could probably actually do it with a phone and a pen and paper, right? Because if you wanted to, you could just draw like your little panels and post them on Instagram, and that's also like a web comic. So,
Yeah, for
yeah,
sure.
like it's the accessibility is definitely the number one thing. You have zero cost after you can transmit your art.
It's
Yeah.
true. There's like so many ways you can kind of share it. It's really exciting. And it's like, yeah, it just keeps kind of changing. And like I
Mhm.
remember seeing loads of stuff on like Tumblr when I was younger, but now there's just like so many places, which is really exciting.
Mhm.
This is a really interesting question. For webcomics, should there be a good balance between narration and dialogue, or should there be as little of both as possible?
So this is question that is true for both web comics and like physical comics, any kind of comic. Um,
Yeah,
the balance of narration and dialogue and imagery should be suited to the narrative that you're trying to tell. I
yeah,
think personally that you shouldn't have if anyone has read Death Note, I think that comic has an atrocious amount of dialogue between the characters at times. Some pages are
mm,
literally shit tons of like text. That's not the most visually attractive. I actually have like a bad example for that I did because I straight up I got to a point where it was quite difficult for me to justify spending more time on a story or like part of the story of my comic. This is like I'm showing my failures. um so this is like a layout I made in one of
oh wow.
my copies of Booza. I think this is really bad. And I'm not going to change it, but it's really bad. And it's bad because it's not really utilizing the medium of comics. And it's not really utilizing the dialogue and the imagery. It is too much dialogue. Originally that dialogue was meant to be across many more pages of like imagery and stuff like that, but I basically decided that with the time limits I had and how much I could invest in, working on my comic in that moment, I just couldn't make more pages, so I condensed them and I sort of cut a lot of corners for myself. But I think that is like a good bad example of like you don't really want to do that in an online comic or in a physical comic. You do want the text and the imagery to be working together. A lot of people get a problem sometimes, especially when you're working with a writer. This often happens, and it's not because the writer's bad or you're a bad artist. It's often because two people working together are trying to do the best job that they can. So they end up doing too much each. So like you might have a
Yeah.
story where like the writer's written all this like amazing like narration and description and dialogue, and the artist is like, I really want to show everything that the writer's shown, and you just have like two things that are telling you the exact same stuff. What you want instead is for your dialogue or narration to be telling you something that images can't, and for your images to be showing something that dialogue and like narration can't,
Yeah.
and like the pairing of that to create something new. So yeah, it should be dependent on the story. There's no like, I think too much text can be too much text, but it should be complementary to your storytelling. That's your main goal with a comic.
Thank you, Shazleen. That's really helpful. Yeah, it's so interesting to think about the relationship between the writer and like the illustrator as well in that sense. That's really interesting.
Hmm.
Um, is there a recommended volume per issue? For example, with print comics, there is a recommended number of pages per issue. I guess you kind
So
of went into like format and like how
yeah.
you like broke your stories up, but yeah.
So for a webcomic, there really isn't, because you don't have any stipulation, except unless someone is actually paying you to do it. You only have stipulations if someone's paying you. I personally, when I'm designing like my scroll comics, I try to make sure that I have at least 8 times a hand goes like this, because that feels like an enough. Or like, I think it's like 5 to 8 times if you have to scroll that many times. It feels like a worthy enough amount of content. But that
Yeah.
is so subjective. It can be, that could be like only a few panels, or it could be like 10, 20 panels. I think webcomic platforms will stipulate a specific panel count for their licensed works. But if you don't have someone paying you and therefore telling you what to do, you're free. You can do whatever you like. However, if you do have someone telling you what to do what this, do that. Like, um, yeah, so is it okay if I buzz through them, Sarah? Just because I do see that we have quite a lot of questions and I do want to get to our ones.
Of
Yeah.
course. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Whatever you're comfortable with.
Yeah. So I'm just gonna read the questions out because I have them in front of me too. Someone else had asked, how finished should the idea be before I start uploading panels? As in, should I have a few ready to upload panels before posting the first one? Yes. You should have a buffer. How much buffer you have is really dependent on how long you want the comic to be, or how, or like, again, how much time you want to invest in it. When I started making Boozer online, I had about 3 or 4 months worth of buffer before I started uploading it. And that's usually quite safe because, you will find some time to make comics around that. I would generally recommend that for everyone. Is think of, if you're like, and again, if you think about it as like, I'm posting one thing a week or once every 2 weeks, 2, 3, 4 months worth of buffer is safe. But yeah, 2 or 3 months, I think I would say. Um, so yeah. And I don't think, just to answer the first part of that question, in terms of like how finished the idea should be, you don't really have to have a full plot. Again, it really does depend on your goals. I had a plot outline, but as is natural with like making something over time, your opinions will change, your goals will change, what you want out of the story may change and evolve, and it's nice to kind of leave that open. So I had like an outline for how long I wanted the story to be, what were my main plot points, but a lot of those have been tweaked or condensed or expanded depending on, like as I've sort of grown as a writer. So having an outline is really, preferable, but you may, start and not have like a very long story you want to tell, and that's also fine. I would say come in with a plan, but it doesn't have to be like every single panel is planned out. Next question was, should I know how the story ends? And this is kind of related actually, is should I know how the story ends before starting to upload the first panels, or go with the flow and let the audience sway what happens? So this is kind of like a multifaceted thing. I think it is really useful to know how your story ends, whatever story you're writing, whether it's a book or a series of comics or a webcomic or whatever. One of my favorite comics is Full Metal Alchemist. I've been thinking about it a lot recently, but it's a manga. Please read it. It's also an anime. You should read. You should watch Brotherhood. I think it's on Netflix. But like Full Metal Alchemist, the author of that had once said in like an interview that she thought of the ending first and she basically worked backwards. And I have done that ever since I've read that advice. I think it's really good both in terms of like character writing or scenario writing to know where the plot has to end, because that should also be really linked to your themes or the things that you are excited to write about. So having like an ending in place, even if it slightly shifts, it is kind of really good to do that. However, you should not, and you know, like I did kind of say, you should kind of allow yourself to change or be a little bit malleable, like you will develop as an author. But what you shouldn't do is let your audience sway what happens. Don't listen to your readers. They are precious and amazing, but they are not you. They are not your authorial intent. We are not AIs generating from prompts from our readers. Like, that's not real. I think you should really not just do things that your readers want. Like, they're coming because they're interested in what you have to say. And you also shouldn't be scared of your readers running away, because that's also fine. They want, you know, like, that's fine. People change. Don't be too swayed by what your audience expects of your work or what they seem to think is going to happen, and also don't think you have to subvert their expectations too. Be very strong in your own mind as to what you want your story to be. Do that work, and don't let your let your audience just enjoy the ride. That's what their job is to enjoy the work you put out, not to dictate what work you're going to put out. This is question 7. What is the best space to start uploading my webcomics? Anywhere that's good. I did answer this a lot in my presentation. I gave a few websites, but it's anywhere that seems suited to your goals. Again, in my presentation, I sort of talked about this, so I won't go into it more. Should I be worried about copyright or IP when I post to platforms? Yes. There are a lot of issues with that. I actually did not go into it, but one of the examples that I gave in this presentation early on when I was showing the webcomics is this webcomic called Webcomic Name Is. I'm actually gonna like put it back because this is a useful thing to share. Oh my gosh, actually, I can't do that, but we're just going to use our imagination. If you look up a comic called Webcomic Name Is by Alex Norris, it is the one with the little pink blobby kind of guy, and he goes, "Oh no," at the end. That comic has not really been posting because it got into a massive legal battle because its copyright was stolen, like literally stolen, by unlawful and, kind of heinous business practices by a company that the author decided to work with and didn't realize what the stipulations of the contract they signed was, and they basically lost rights to their comic, and they've been fighting a very long legal battle trying to regain those rights. A lot of webtoon artists also have very predatory contracts. So this is like, and this is specifically Webtoon the company. They have been notorious for very like bad rights in terms of like equity and paying, but also bad rights in terms of copyright grabs and rights of adaptation and rights of like printing and all that kind of stuff. Usually this is kind of a bit of a different conversation, but if you are someone who works professionally as an artist or even as an amateur and kind of just getting into it, be really careful about the contracts you sign and what you're signing up to when someone offers you money, even if it's crap money. Be really careful of it, because sometimes it's better to have zero money and all your rights than to sell your rights unknowingly for like very little. You can, I think we have like later on you may have like conversations about agents and other things to do with rights and IP. So I'll let that be a conversation for another time. But yeah, you should absolutely be very aware of your own rights and your intellectual property rights when you post. Question number 9, does it help to have a pre-established online following before starting to post things? Yeah, but you can also do it without it. When I started posting Booza, I had like less than 1,000 followers on Instagram. I had like 2,000 followers on Twitter back when Twitter was good in the good old days. And like that's not a lot of followers. My webcomic within I think the first couple of years got to be like a readership of like 10,000, 20,000. It's now sitting nearly 60,000 on its 2 platforms combined. It also has a publishing deal. Like, it's helpful to have an audience, but the webcomic itself can then lead it to an audience too. So that was question 9. Question 10 is, do you have a foolproof way to find out who your target audience is and then reach it? So for me, personally, I knew that my audience, I really wanted to reach a YA/new adult demographic. And that's a demographic that doesn't have necessarily always a lot of money. So making stuff for free is great for them. I also, like I was saying, I was interested in a global audience. I'm interested in like American and Canadian, like English language readers, but I'm also interested in international, like Asian and African readers who may relate to the story that I'm making. So that was like a big part of why I chose Tapas. I actually did originally post my comic only on Tapas, but I realized there was more of an international and specifically Asian, and I'm not just saying like East Asian, like Korea, China, Japan. I also meant like South Asian, Middle Eastern, and I think there are like African and also South American readers on Webtoon. So that's actually a big reason why I decided to go on Webtoon, is because they had more of that international market rather than focusing mostly on English language market like Tapas did. And that was very like important for me. When I guess your main thing when you're making any kind of story is really do think about your target audience. Usually it's going to be someone kind of similar to you if you're writing a story that's very personal to yourself. But there is, I think audience is such a big thing. I don't want to spend too much because that could be a lecture in itself. So I'm gonna move on. Okay. 11, how/when could you make money from webcomics? It's not gonna happen. The best way to make money from webcomics is to post them online and then have something like a Patreon where someone can directly pay you, or to physically print them or like do something like that. So even then though, you're kind of transforming, if you're making it printed, you're sort of transforming it into something else, and it would still have to be like an investment of your own money or crowdfunding the money to cover those costs, and then also the labor itself of like shipping them or going to shows to sell and things like that. For me, doing Kickstarters was genuinely a big portion of my income before I got a publishing deal for Booza. And that is also a thing, is like, you may be able to get publishing deal if you don't end up self-publishing. You may have better chances as well to get a publishing deal for your webcomic. But when it is just a comic on the internet for free, usually the best way is to say, hey, I have this up for free, but if you sub to my Patreon or whatever other thing, you can get more of it. Or you can get it earlier. That's usually the model people use, is they'll be like, this amount is free, and then all the new updates are on my Patreon first, and then it'll be like a month or a few weeks later, you'll get it for free afterwards. And lastly, and this is kind of similar, is it worth having work behind a paywall or ads on a website to make some extra money? I really don't trust ad revenue personally. I don't really know. I've never actually had experience to do ad revenue, but I genuinely wouldn't see that as a particularly equitable or sometimes even ethical way to make money, because you don't really get to choose what ads you have a lot of the time. I think there are some ad providers that are maybe a bit more ethical. But yeah, when you're just posting and you have like Google AdSense or whatever, like you don't really choose what you display. And I don't really like the idea of, someone could come to read my webcomic and there's a particularly unsavory ad on the page too. I just don't really like the idea of that. But I do think it is worth having things in a paywall. Like I was saying, Patreon is the way that Patreon or another subscription model is the way that you typically be doing that. So there is something useful for it. I'm gonna, if it's okay, Sarah, sorry, I'm trying to be sensitive of our time as well. So is it okay if I just read through the chat and have a look through our questions? Because we have a bunch of questions here too. Thank you everyone again for for engaging so well and everything. I do, just to check, Sarah, like we have about 10 minutes left, right?
That's right.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So let's see. I'm gonna do these questions step by step. So we have a question. I'm gonna just say people's names, sorry, but I'm gonna address you guys. We have a question from Rabia. What was your pre-production stage like when writing the comic? Did you have a script beforehand or go straight into thumbnailing? So my pre-production was very, this is applicable for a lot of different comics. I basically had a text outline. I had like my characters. I had the main characters I wanted to focus on. Pretty thorough descriptions of like who they were, kind of their backstory, you know, everything that made them a person, and I had an idea of what their story arc and motivation was going to be. This is a very character-driven narrative. It is very much about interpersonal relationships, and it's a romance and all that kind of stuff. So having the characters down was very important. So I had my sort of key 4, 5, 6 characters, their story arcs and their kind of trajectory during the comic that was already laid out when I started. And then I had kind of an idea of the ending, what I wanted the final conflict to be, and then the final conflict resolution to be, and how that conflict resolution played out was roughed out. And then I had like my first volume of story, you know, I sort of wrote that. So particularly for Booza, I had the first 4 chapters written down, I think, to the script level, and then I had a sequence of like events or chapter ideas that I would, after doing the first 4, I then like went and would flesh out bit by bit as I was going, until I got to a point where I was like, oh, okay, that's where the first volume should end. So the first 4 chapters of Booza are designed to introduce every like main 4 characters. They all have kind of like an interlinked storyline, and I'm very proud of it personally. So that was kind of what my basis was, and then I worked off from there. When I finished my first volume, I then kind of kept going, so I'd have like a list of scenarios or ideas linked to the character's sort of story arc and trajectory, and I step by step kind of like flesh them out, do about 8 or 9 at a time for each volume, and then just keep going like that, and then, you know, make the comic. Like so Xanderfist has, I think this is a longer question. I'm going to read it out, but I might not be able to answer this one because, again, I do want to try and answer questions that would be relevant to the group, rather than specific like things, but I will read this out. So yeah, so this person, Xanderfist, has, I'll just read it out. I've been making my own webcomic for a few months now, and it's based on my own experience with some of the things that you yourself have been dealing with. But I've been struggling to get people to read, like, and subscribe, and I'm wondering if a niche comic like that could make people uncomfortable, and will it be hard to get readers for it? It's a passion project, but what advice would you have? And then also they say later on that they've been posting on Webtoon and Tapas. So my main advice is actually this might be a comic that is better suited for social media rather than Webtoon and Tapas. Webtoon and Tapas are very narrative-driven platforms, and while there are like gag comics and kind of more informal comics that do well on them, I think a comic that's much more personal and also maybe, you know, it's kind of like something that is relatable to a lot of people who actually maybe aren't just comic readers. So if you're writing something about your personal experience, your own experience with your own sort of like struggles, that might be something that someone who's never read a comic will really relate to, and they may really, you know, find it like comforting or empowering or kind of reflective of their own experience, and they'd want to share it and stuff. So I would encourage you to take it off of, or like not take it off, but you consider posting it and making like an Instagram account specifically for the comic, and posting it on something like Instagram, because it might actually find a bigger audience there. Audience finding is really difficult, and it is a struggle generally to try and get like traction in your work and stuff like that. So I have nothing but sympathy. We're all in this hell together. But I do suggest try Instagram, because Webtoon and Tapas, I think a lot of the people there are looking for genre fiction and longer form narratives rather than stuff that's more introspective. Okay. Astro has a question, which is, how would you approach getting traction on your webcomics and social without giving the storyline away? I recently heard, so I'm just gonna like read this a bit better. It's traction on webcomics on socials without giving the storyline. I've heard that apparently posting is good. I think you should learn to shitpost. I'm also this week trying to shitpost more. I have the exact same struggle with myself because I have all these memes in my head about the future of my comic, but I'm like, damn, it doesn't exist. I can't be spoiling. Sometimes it's okay to spoiler. If it's an ongoing work, I think you gotta let go of your pride and integrity for the sake of marketing, and you gotta just put your silly spoiler shit posts out. You know, ultimately you're just trying to engage people into reading and being interested in your work, and if you kind of can say, you know, something that is maybe a bit vague, and kind of enticing. Like people, you know, like it might actually not end up being that much of a spoiler anyway, or people will still enjoy it, you know, it's fine. I think we look at so much media now that's like, you know, I see so many reels that are like like a soap opera plot from like 20 years ago, and it will be like a single scene, and I'll end up looking up the soap opera if I'm not like aware of it, or the drama program or whatever. And sometimes I find shows I like from that. So, you know, like it's okay to give a very spoilery or plot dense like meme post, because showing it kind of out of context, it often is just helpful and enticing to viewers who are more casual, maybe. Um, that so Fatima has a question. Do you have any advice for getting your foot in the door, or is it mostly persevering to build up an audience and support? It's perseverance. It's a lot of perseverance. It's also pushing yourself to meet people. I think that's a very important thing too. And also actually going to physical events and meeting like potential clients or doing active outreach. Seems a bit more of a general question into illustration and publishing as an industry rather than just webcomics. But yeah, you do have to slowly persevere and also actively be seeking out opportunities. Yeah, both of those things. Um, Carmen has a question. Thank you. I'm glad that I'm an inspiration. It's very sweet of you. I was wondering if you had any tips to maintain intrigue and drama for pacing slice of slice of life as a genre. Sometimes I worry I'm meandering too much, but I want to have a lot of character bonding moments. Hope that makes sense. Thank you. Um, I think this is kind of, there's two answers. One, you're beholden to no one but yourself, and meandering is only meandering if you decide it's meandering, because no one's telling you how to write the story. So it's totally fine if you want to go on tangents and you want to have it be very slow paced, that's fine. If you're worried, but the other thing is, intrigue and drama is not always conducive to slice of life. Like if you have a real slice of life comic where nothing is really happening, that's totally fine. It can be completely episodic or like very like limited episodes and stuff, and it, you know, people may just enjoy it. If you do have intrigue and drama, I think the best recommendation would be like making sure every scene or every upload tells you something really specific about the characters. That's kind of what motivates a lot of the stories in Buza. Like there will be these sort of shorter chapters, like I showed earlier, but they're kind of designed to tell you something either about our lead characters or the world they're living in, which, you know, you may not know. So like there's like parts of the comic is just the characters praying, or and it sort of tells you something about their relationship to faith and their own identity or something. Or like earlier I showed a sequence that was called like Lazy Saturday, and it's just the first actual slice of life moment you see of these two characters living together after they've just started living together. So it's kind of important to show what the dynamic is like, and you learn a little bit about each of them as we go through that sequence. I think maybe this will have to be the last question. So Libby asks, most conferencey cool question ever. In the age of AI and image scraping, I imagine posting and platforming trends might be shifting as artists rightfully don't want to have their art stolen. What directions do you imagine posting online might take? Are there any interesting trends you've seen? And I'm just going to read the next comment as well. Yes, if a reader is going to drop out because, oh, this is just, you're just agreeing with your own, with the point I made. Okay, cool. So I recently heard, I do not go on Twitter anymore since the takeover. This is a hostile destruction of my home. And so like I don't like pay attention to what artists are doing there, but if you are aware of things on Twitter, you will know that the Grok AI has been committing crimes on there and committing crimes to people constantly. So artists who don't want their images being manipulated by the Grok AI have been posting it as GIFs because Grok can't do GIFs right now. I wonder if stuff like that, like using more archaic, because GIFs are actually technically, I think, a more archaic and less accessible image format, or like image/video format. I wonder if doing things like that will change things. I wonder if, again, I feel like we've seen a really massive shift towards like traditional media, and people are posting videos more and more of like, you know, making stuff with traditional media and paintings and all that kind of stuff. Literally yesterday, I saw an animation someone made through like just a flipbook animation, and it was with like Copic markers, and it was the most beautiful thing I've seen in so long. So I think there's a lot of different trends and people fighting against it. My personal take is I actually don't give a shit about AI, as in like I think it's a really big problem, but I think it's a workers' rights issue rather than a artistic integrity issue. It's like destroying the jobs of artists. But in the same way, that's why it kind of doesn't affect me, because the work I do as an artist is valued by the industry I'm in, thankfully, and is also very nuanced and quite still difficult for AI to, you know, now literally thousands of pages of comic at this point. Like it can generate it, but the characters won't look the same, or like there's also not going to be any of the thought or whatever. Like people read books because they want to read a good story, and I think the people who use and hire the people who use AI for monetized purposes, they were never gonna read a book. They were never gonna read my book, so I don't care about them. I do care about how they devalue our industry and how they are limiting work in other aspects of the illustration and publishing. Well, not as much publishing, thankfully, but in other parts of creative industries as a whole. And that I think is more of an issue with AI. But yeah, I think we're right at 6:30. Do you want to? I think that is all the questions as well. We did do all of them.
You whizzed through them all. Thank you,
No
Shazleen. And thank you,
worries.
everybody, for coming. That was really a lot of fun. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Thank you for hearing me yap for this time.
It was very informative yapping. Thank you, Shazleen. Yeah, that should be it now, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. I'm going to say goodbye.
Yeah, bye.
Bye, everyone.